Hey guys, this is Bryan with Prokashi.com back in Lawrenceville, Georgia, and this is the second part of IMO, or Indigenous Microorganisms. Alright guys, on our first part of the video, if you haven't seen it, go back. It's IMO 1, or Indigenous Microorganisms 1. We're using Korean natural farming techniques to make beneficial microbes, and the reason that we're going to make these indigenous beneficial microbes is that they are very good for soil fertility, for plant health, and for nutrient cycling. And in the first video I taught you how to collect them, to cultivate them, and now we're going to continue on with that series. As a quick recap, IMO 1, or Indigenous Microbes 1, is where we take rice, dry rice that's been boiled so that it's not wet, and we've allowed it to grow or be a culture medium for some of the indigenous microbes. The reason we want the indigenous microbes, again, is that they're local. They live here. They are the strongest. They are the ones that are the dominant ones. They're not the weak ones, and we're going to put them to use. IMO 2 is when we take that collected fuzzy white cotton looking stuff off of our rice and we mix it with sugar, and in this case we use brown sugar. We use brown sugar because it's a natural sugar. White sugar, I guess you could use it, but I wouldn't because it's been bleached, and the bleach may not be all that great. We use bleach to clean our house, and it kills microbes and stuff like that, so I don't want to risk killing the microbes that I just created. So I use brown sugar. You can use molasses if you'd like. And what we did when we did the IMO 2 is we took the rice and the microbes, mixing them with the sugar. We've allowed them to rest, to ferment, to propagate, and this is what we have. This, if you remember, is IMO 2. It looks like an oatmeal, a gruel, if you will. It's kind of slow moving, and if you notice, you've got a little bit of white stuff growing in there. That's perfectly normal. You'll see some growth on the material. That's not unusual whatsoever. So what we're going to do now is we're going to go to IMO 3. And as I explained earlier, the most confusing thing it seems that people have trouble with is, what is IMO 1? What is IMO 2? What is IMO 3? What is IMO 4? You're getting tired of saying it. What it is, number 1 is how we collect it. We use the rice. IMO 2 is how we propagate it, which is with brown sugar. And IMO 3 is where we take this and add it to another substrate. IMO 1, the substrate was rice. IMO 2, the substrate was microbes, rice, and sugar. Now we're going to IMO 3, which is the microbes, rice, sugar, and we're going to put it onto wheat bran, or mill run. Mill run is a term that we use here for the leavings that you find at a wheat mill. At a wheat mill, obviously we're trying to take the wheat. We have the chaff, we have the germ, we have the flour, and the wheat mill run is really the stuff that's left on the floor and just packaged up and given to the animals. And even though we just consider it a waste, hey, that was on the floor, we feed it to our animals. Actually, it's pretty good stuff. It has a lot of nutrient value. So we're going to take that waste material and use it, because it has a lot of nutrient value, to propagate our IMO 2 into IMO 3. So I'll show you how to do that in just a second, and we'll discuss some of the reasons why, and some of the reasons why I think you do it that way. Even though Master Cho, the founder of the Korean natural farming, didn't put it in so many words, if you sit and think about it a little bit, it makes sense as to why we're going to do it this way. So hang on just a second, let me collect a few things and we'll get right to it. Okay guys, I'm back. With the IMO 2, we have our rice and we have our sugar. We could make IMO 3, or we could use it as it is now. This material that I have in here, which is the rice bran, or the rice with the microbes and the sugar, in this state we can store it. One of the big questions people ask is, well, how long can I store it? You can store it in this state, just like this, probably for a year, maybe 2. The way to go about storing it, if you were going to try to keep it like this, say you wanted to make a big batch, you can't use it all at once. What you would do is store it like this. The traditional technique is to take this material. This I've watered down a little bit so it's a little thin, but this is what we made in the last video, and you see it's kind of real gluey, sticks and holds its shape. Traditional technique is to use a clay jar that has some straw or something in the bottom so that there's airflow or air movement underneath. You would then take this material here, your IMO2, place it inside, and then put the lid on your clay jar. And when you put the lid on the clay jar, they say put a little straw across the top, and what that does is picks the lid up and allows airflow. The whole key to this is cool, dark, and well aerated, or airflow. That way you don't get any anaerobic pockets or cause it to go bad quickly. So technically speaking, as you saw it from the first video and as you see it now, you can store it just like this for about a year or so, and you won't have any problems. Remember, this is a living product. Keep it out of the sun. Keep it away from high temperatures. They say, what, 5 to 15 degrees Celsius. So let's just say 45 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit-ish. So you could store it for a long period of time. Another way to store it, or another way to stabilize it, is that if you don't want to keep it in this fashion, you can store it in a liquid form. And what we're going to do, or what I'm going to do, is show you one way to store it in a liquid form. This is just a bucket that I have, a little 4-gallon bucket, and the whole purpose, or the whole intent behind this, is to take the IMO and mix it with water. We're going to store it in a liquid form, and I'll have to scrape that out in just a second. And to do that, to store it in that liquid form, we're going to mix 1 part IMO, 2 to 3 parts water. Now the water that you use is important in that it needs to be chlorine free. I live in a place where the municipal people that bring us the water mix chlorine in the water. So what I've had to do is take a bucket of water, and I've allowed this bucket of water to set out. And I let it set out overnight. Here we have chlorine. If you live in a place where they have what's called chloramine, or chlorine and ammonia mix, what you can do is add a teaspoon of citric acid. Citric acid is probably something you're not going to have in your kitchen unless you bake a lot. Citric acid is used in baking, and you can go to your local grocery store and get citric acid in the baking or the spice aisle. And what you would do for a container this size, about 5-gallon size, is you'll go ahead and take 1 teaspoon of the citric acid, mix it in there, and just let it set overnight. The citric acid will get rid of the ammonia of the chloramine. The chlorine itself will off-gas. If you're into compost tea making, you'll understand that you can put a bubbler in here. If you have a small air stone and a pump for your aquarium, you can put that in there. But for the people that don't have those means, for the people that don't have electricity, and there are a lot of people that practice this that don't have those conveniences like I happen to have, you can just take water out of the river. You can use rainwater, any natural water source from a well, doesn't matter. As long as it doesn't have the chlorine or chloramine, you'll be fine. So what I did is I have my water here, and I put my IMO2 in here. And the reason I'm doing this is you can store it the traditional method like I discussed, or you can store it and stabilize it by just adding 3 parts water. So I'm going to do just that. And the nice thing about natural farming is that it's not an exact science, and it's very forgiving. So I had half of this container full of IMO, and since I had 2 of them, I had 1 full container. Now I've just taken 1 full container of my IMO with 3 parts of the water, and I'll scrape that out in a minute, and I just mix it up. And that's it. You can keep this in this form in the same temperatures and fashions out of direct sunlight, between 45 and 70 degrees. You want to keep it nice and cool. That would be, I guess, what, between 5 and 15 C. And I'm just mixing it up. What I'm going to do is I'm going to strain it out so that I can get all the little bits and the pieces out. Let's see if I can get this little bit off of the bottom here with this one. There we go. Let me give it one more stir, and I'm going to strain this out. And that's it, guys. That is your IMO2 that you can either store for a year or so in a dry or a semi-dry form, or you can store it in this liquid form. Let me strain this out. I'm just going to use a bucket that I have around the house. That's one of my bokashi buckets. If you've seen my other videos, you've seen them around. You've seen this from the first video, something that I stole from my wife's baking things, and it just so happens that it fits nicely in the top of my bucket. And I'm just going to pour this out to strain out the bits and the pieces. And when I'm done this, I'll either leave it in this bucket or I'll put it in smaller containers. All right, I took time to mix and strain out the IMO2. This is our final result. Each one of these plastic containers is about a gallon. So for my 1 cup of rice that I invested and I made IMO1, and for the 1 bag of brown sugar that I invested when I made IMO2, I have just made and stabilized 2 gallons of IMO2. This is the leftovers right here, and what I'm going to do is just throw them into my compost pile. The microbes and all are still in here. I just happen to have a lot more of them in the solution here, but I'm not going to throw this away. I'm going to put it into my compost pile, or you can work it into your soil. The microbes are still in there and alive. I wouldn't suggest reusing it to make more, or extending more IMO2, just because it's going to be a weaker IMO. Some of this food source is spent, and then your next generation that'll grow up in there will probably not be as strong, and it just takes longer. You're starting with a smaller population. You're trying to rebuild them because we have pulled out in solution so much of them here. It's just so much easier and probably more productive. You can try it, but me personally, I'm not going to. So now I have my IMO2 stabilized. This is what it looked like in the original form, and now we're off to making IMO3. Traditional technique to make IMO3 is to use a 50-pound bag of wheat mill run. If you're in the Philippines, Malaysia, Taiwan, places like that, you'll probably just use rice hulls or rice meal mixed in. Wheat mill run is, as I explained earlier, a byproduct off of the wheat mill floor. It is the wheat bran that was separated in the process of making wheat meal or wheat flour. It'll have some of the germs, some of the grain. It's a very nutritious product. here in Georgia, what I do, I don't have Midlands, which is another southern term for wheat mill run. I have wheat bran, which is here. This is what I actually make my Prokashi wheat bran out of, and it is very nutritious. It is a good source of food and energy, and since I don't have wheat mill run, and wheat mill run is just wheat bran with the leftovers on the floor, what I do is I take wheat flour. This is whole wheat flour, and I'm just going to mix a portion in. This just happens to be 1 cup. I'm going to mix that in to my wheat bran to simulate wheat mill run. And again, the reason I do that, from the floor of the factory, there's going to be some wheat flour, and there's going to be wheat germ, and there's going to be a lot of parts of the whole product that I just don't have here. So I'm going to simulate that. Korean natural farming is about using what you have. And what I have is wheat bran and wheat flour, so I'll make my own. For those of you who are curious, I just used a cup of wheat flour in this particular mixture. I could use a half cup, I could use 2 cups, use whatever I want. It's because, you know, with Korean natural farming, there's a lot of latitude. In the traditional technique, you would use wheat mill run, or you would use the flour. You would use a 50-pound sack. This is obviously not 50 pounds. I believe this is about 12 pounds. Again, this is what I use to make my Prokashi wheat bran, and this is actually the container and all that I use to mix it. So I know that that's about 10 to 12 pounds. Traditional technique would use 5 gallons of water, so you would have a full 5-gallon bucket of water, dechlorinated, with about 10 grams or a tablespoon of IMO 2 in that state. That's the original state. So that's about what 10 grams looks like. So in a 5-gallon bucket of water, we would add a portion, which is about a tablespoon, a teaspoon and a half to a tablespoon to the 5 gallons of water. If you don't have a measuring stick, say you're out in the field, you don't have a tablespoon, you don't own a scale to measure 10 grams by weight to add to your 5 gallons of water, what you would do is you would take your IMO 2 and you would pull out a piece about the size of what we call a Vienna sausage here. It's the little canned meat sausages that we have here. We use them for cocktails and stuff like that. You would just use a small sausage size piece, and you would mix that in with your water, your 5 gallons of water. So I'm going to do that now. 5 gallons of water is almost 600 ounces. There's 120 ounces to a US gallon. So a little over 1 ounce, 1.2 ounces to 5 or 600 ounces would be your 500 to 1. If you're mixing it with you know, the metric system, say you've got, you know, 1,000 liters, you're going to want, you know, for 1,000 to 1 liter. For 500 to 1, you're going to want 2 liters. And you can break it down to mils and centiliters, however you want. But all you need to do is take a little bit of IMO 2, mix it with your dechlorinated water, and now we're going to mix it in with the wheat mill run, or in my case, wheat bran with flour. Again, overseas you may use rice bran, and then it's the same equivalent. So give me just a second and we'll start mixing this up. Okay. Traditional technique says that you would take a 50-pound sack of wheat mill run, in our case, and to 5 gallons of water you would add about 10 grams by weight, by dilution 500 to 1,000 to 1 of your IMO 2. And what I have done is done just that. I'm going to make this on a smaller scale, so this is about 12 pounds. This is my water IMO solution. You'll notice it's a little darker than previously. What traditional technique says to do is to take your IMO2 with your 5 gallons of water, and that you would add OHN, Oriental Herbal Nutrient, to it. And that is really a fermentation or a concoction of angelica, licorice, cinnamon, and things of that nature. Add it to that water mixture. And to that water mixture with the IMO2 and the OHN being diluted at about 1,000 to 1 to that water mixture, you would add fermented plant juice. Fermented plant juice is another Korean natural farming technique that uses mugwort, dropwort, any fast-growing or vibrant plant material to add chlorophyll, enzymes, the growth hormones, and things like that of the plant that we've extracted through fermentation processes to this mixture here. Also, they would probably tell you, and that would be at about 500 to 1,000 to 1 as well. They would tell you to add fermented plant juice, brown rice vinegar. These are all inputs, Korean natural farming inputs, that you can add into this. And their whole purpose is to grow the microbes, to add enzymes, growth hormones, just increase the value of the material that we're making, so that when we do put it to the plant or to the soil, we have an excellent concoction. Again, we're microbe farmers, and every bit of this that we're doing is either some type of digestive enzyme, some growth promotant, or to assist the growth of the natural organisms. What I did here, since I don't have OHN, and I haven't made in a while any fermented plant juices. I don't have mugwort. I don't have dropwort. I do have things I can use. In Georgia, I have kudzu vine, which is a very fast-growing vine, if you know what a kudzu plant is. I could also use what grows in the ponds here, which is, we call it duckweed. It's the weed or the plant that grows on top of the pond, and it's very fast-growing. And I would make a fermented plant juice out of that. I don't have any fermented fruit juices. I haven't made any of that yet. So what I have done, Korean natural farming is all about using what you have. I put my IMO2 in here, and I added a little bit of molasses. Molasses is a sugar. It's a natural sugar. Make sure that you use non-sulfured molasses, because the sulfur in molasses is a stabilizing agent which would kill fungus and bacteria, and we don't want to do that. We're in the business of growing them. So I used non-sulfured molasses to simulate some of the fermented plant juice, because the fermented plant juice is really just plant sugars and enzymes. And what I'm doing is mixing my wheat mill run and getting it to a certain moisture content. Traditional technique says that you want it to be between 65 and 70% water content. And the first question I asked is, how the heck do I know that? I don't have a moisture meter. I don't have a science lab with all this fancy stuff. So here's a very simple technique. When you're mixing, and it's going to take a little while, when you're mixing and you're adding your water, you want to say, wow, fill capacity is that amount of water that the soil can reasonably hold, and that's a gardening term. And fill capacity is basically when you can take your soil, pick it up, squeeze it, and no water runs out. But when you open it up, it holds its shape. Now, if you notice, this is opening up and kind of flaking apart, and it's not well mixed right now, obviously, but it's not dripping water. So here's your two choices. You're going along and you're mixing. You pick up what you have, you squeeze it real hard, there's no water coming out, but you let it loose and it just falls apart like this. It's too dry. Let's say you're going along and you're adding some water and you pick it up and you're like, okay, squeeze it. And I don't know if I can get it to do it for you. See, the water is dripping out of my hand, but it holds its shape. See, I squeezed it, it holds its shape. It doesn't go anywhere, but if I flake it, it comes apart in chunks like that. But the water dripped out of my hand. I had too much water. What you want is the in-between state, so that when you take it out, put it in your hand, you squeeze it really tightly. And there's no water coming out of this, and I'm squeezing really tightly. There's no water dripping out. But when I let it loose, you can see my finger grooves, it's holding its shape. It's going to open up a little bit. But when you touch it, it just breaks apart. That is about 60%. The biggest failures that you'll see in a lot of gardening, whether you're growing something, whether you're making compost, or you're making IMO 3, is the water content is wrong. You either have too much or you have too little. So the way to do this without the fancy gadgets, gizmos, and moisture meters is to add water until such time as that it's well mixed, that when you pick it up and you squeeze it as hard as you can, there's no water coming out, but it holds its shape. And then you can just flake it apart. So the next question that begs to be asked is, how much water do I use? Well, you have mixed your IMO 2 with your water and your inputs. If you happen to have OHN, it's in there. If you happen to have fermented plant juice, it's in there. If you happen to have fermented fruit juice, it's in there. Whatever is in there, it's your 500 to 1,000 to 1 mixture. Just keep adding water. The water amount is only based on how dry your material is. So if you have a really dry material, you're obviously going to need a little bit more water than if you had something that, like your wheat mill run, is a little moist already. So the amount of water is solely dependent on the moisture content of the dry material with which you're starting. In my case, since I make my Bokashi brand, I know from my experience that this tote right here with about 10 to 12 pounds of wheat bran, which is what I started with. Now I added wheat meal or wheat flour, so that's going to change my mixture a little bit, but just in general, I know that this container from experience will hold 12 pounds and it takes me about 130 ounces. So if I didn't know that, I would just take whatever I have in here, start mixing it well, and as you notice, as I mix, I find dry spots. I'll come up with dry spots on the bottom. You can see it's all dry in here, so that does take a while to do. But once I get it homogeneous, it's all well mixed, and I can pick it up, squeeze it really tight, no water drips out, and it looks like that. That's your water content. That's your proper water content. So give me just a couple minutes and let me mix this up, and then we'll carry on from here. All right, it's been about 10 or 15 minutes and I've mixed the wheat mill run with the IMO 2. I mixed it with, again, 500 to 1,000 parts water. That would be 10 grams by weight for a 5-gallon bucket of water to 50 pounds of wheat mill run. In my case, I just used a smaller amount, so I used 500 to 1. And traditional technique, again, you would put your oriental herbal nutrients, your OHN, your fermented plant juice, your fermented fruit extract, your brown rice vinegar, all the stuff that I don't have. So what I do, according to natural farming techniques, is I use what I have. So you just saw me take about 2 gallons of water, dechlorinated, mix it in with about 12 pounds of rice bran or wheat bran that I added wheat flour to simulate wheat mill run, and I mixed it up, and here's the results of that. You can see, I can squeeze it, holds its shape, no water drips out, and then it'll just flake apart. Traditional technique will tell you that you're going to let this rest or ferment about 5 to 7 days in an area where it's in contact with the ground. So if you remember my other video, that's my IMO 4 pile. Underneath those leaves is a pile that I've previously made, and I'm going to put my IMO 3 here on the bare ground. You can see this ground is actually really soft. This was hard clay, and you can probably still see a little bit of the light clay color mixed in. But since the IMO 4's been there, in the little microbes, the micro arthropods, all the life in the soil and all, is rebuilding this once hard, useless Georgia red clay soil. So what I'm going to do is, in traditional technique, you would just pile it up on the ground, on the soil. There you go. Some more little creepy guys, more little livy creepy guys. Traditional technique says that you're going to have it in contact with the surface, not on a concrete surface, not on a plastic surface. You want it in touch with the ground because, again, this is all about the microbes. So, wow, even more stuff, guys. The more I sit there and look at my soil, there you go, just staring at the soil, about ready to put all this stuff on there. Here I am in December. It's almost winter time, and you can see all the life in the critters that are around. They will say, Master Cho being they, that you'll put your material in contact with the soil, and you're going to stack it anywhere between 12 to 15 inches high, and then you're going to cover it. What I'm going to do is just put it in my raised bed box. This is one of the boxes that you've seen from my video earlier this year. This was the box that had all the wonderful worms in it when I was using the Bokashi composting. And I'm going to stack this stuff in here. And what we're going to allow it to do is to set, generally speaking, 5 to 7 days and ferment. Traditional technique is to go ahead and put it in a shaded spot. That traditional technique is based on doing this probably in the spring near the summertime when the temperatures are much higher. Again, here I am 2 weeks away from Christmas actually, and it's cold out. So what I have done is I've used this box, whereas I would just normally mound it up. You see my IMO 4 pile just mounded up. There you go, more stuff. That's all the stuff that's living and growing. And that's what we're about. We're trying to get all these guys to live and to grow. And here we are, 30-degree nights, and you've got all this life still alive in the soil. Our purpose here is to allow this to ferment. You stack it 12 to 15 inches tall so that it has enough mass to actually heat up. This is going to heat up. And you're supposed to do this in a shaded area because, again, this is a living product. It doesn't look like it, but this is all alive. So what I'm going to do is put a little bit of wheat straw on top and cover it up. The wheat straw keeps the UV off of it, allows the microbes to grow and to multiply. It also holds the heat down a little bit. In my case, being winter time, if you don't have wheat straw, guys, use a piece of burlap. Use dried leaves. You can see those are the leaves over there that I've used. Use what you have at hand, and then that's it. That is your IMO 3 from IMO 2 added to wheat mill run and left to ferment. So what we'll have to do is revisit this in a couple of weeks. Usually it's 5 to 7 days, but again, because of the temperatures here, it's more likely going to be about 14 days. And then what you're going to notice is that when we pull this back, all of this stuff here will be a white colony. It'll look like white dried rice that's clumped together, and that's going to be the mycelium. That's going to be all the little fibers and fingers and cotton candy stuff grown back again, and this is all going to become an aggregate or a solid clumped up piece. What you will have to do while you're waiting for this to happen is you're going to have to check this pile. For me, probably in about 2 or 3 days, it will heat up. And in the summertime, I've actually registered the temperature with a thermometer at about 140 degrees. What you want to do is once it gets to about 120 to 130 degrees, that's where you want it to stay, because that's when the microbes are doing their best. Once you get above that, you start getting into a thermophilic stage or a high temperature stage, and you start breaking down some of the proteins. You start losing some of the beneficials that we don't want to lose. That's more of a traditional American hot style of composting, and that's not what Korean natural farming is about. We're more about a fermentive style of composting for various reasons. But in a couple days, I'll come back and check on this right here, and I'll measure the temperature. If the temperature is not over 130 degrees, I'll leave it alone. If it is, I'll pull this aside, I'll come in, turn it over to release the heat, and then let it go back to doing what it's doing. If for some reason you're doing this in a dry area and you notice it getting dry, you can go ahead and mist the surface of this down with water. You can use a little bit of brown rice vinegar. It's another product called macchioli, and if you're Korean and I mispronounced it, please forgive me. I'm just from Georgia. Macchioli is a rice wine. It's a fermented rice wine, and the reason you use the brown rice vinegar in the rice wine is they're fermented products. And what are we doing? We're fermenting here. So they have a really good synergistic effect. So you can moisten it with some water. You can put your brown rice vinegar or macchioli on there if you need to add or adjust moisture, but if not, leave it be. So this is Bryan with Prokashi.com back in Lawrenceville, Georgia, and we'll come back to this probably in about 10-14 days, and I'll show you how to take IMO 3 and turn it into IMO 4. So I hope this helps out. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.